The Pacific Island nations, microstates with small populations and economies, hold geostrategic importance that transcends their relative size. China is seeking to further insulate itself within the region, offering security solutions and infrastructure development which target the vulnerabilities of these smaller states, with the aim of increasing its presence in the quote-unquote backyard of Australia, Japan, and the United States. This, of course, is the backdrop for our latest Metro Series webinar hosted by the CDA Institute and moderated by non-resident senior fellow for the Indo-Pacific at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and CDA Institute fellow Cleo Paskal, which brings together representatives from the US, Australia, and Japan to offer their unique and at times diverging perspectives on the operating environment in the Indo-Pacific. Representatives explain how they perceive their respective roles, discuss their national engagement with the Pacific Island nations, and describe challenges their respective countries have encountered in the region, which have centered largely around great power competition, climate change-related threats, and the governance issues of microstates. Ultimately, there is much Canada can learn from its allies as it develops its own Indo-Pacific strategy. Canada must develop its strategic interests in the Indo-Pacific and acknowledge the impact it can have on the region. Panelists included Dr. John Blaxland, professor at the Bell School of Asian-Pacific Affairs at Australian National University, Dr. Rieko Hayakawa, Ph.D. at Doshisha University, and Colonel Grant Newsham, professor at the Strategic and Defense Studies Center and research fellow at the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies.
We're really lucky to have three people who are coming from different countries, but who understand the operating environment of the other ones extremely well. So we're going to be talking with, first is going to be Professor John Blaxland, who's a professor of international relations and intelligence studies at Strategic and Defense Studies Center at the Coral Bell School of Asian Pacific Affairs at Australian National University, who's done very important work on the Pacific for a long time, but again, also really understands how the US has been operating in the region, Japan, and others. Then we'll have Dr. Reiko Hayakawa, who's at Doshisha University. She has been working in the Pacific for over 2 decades, actually probably more, and has been very instrumental in developing some of Japan's engagement in the region. And she's currently an advisor for Palau's National Security Office, which I hope she'll talk to us a little bit about. And then we'll have Colonel Grant Newsham, who's a senior research fellow for the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies. He's the former reserve head of intelligence for the Marine Forces in the Pacific, and he helped to stand up Japan's amphibious capability. So again, somebody who understands how other people have had to engage in the region extremely well. So what I'm going to do first is just a very quick 2 or 3 minute overview of why we're talking about this region right now, even though all three of the panelists have been speaking about it for decades. So the region is enormous. It's about 1/6 of the planet. There are over a score independent countries in the region. They've been divided in a kind of quite post-colonial way into 3 large regions, Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia. And through the kind of Five Eyes construct and some other constructs, different parts of the zone have been kind of led from a strategic perspective from different countries. So Polynesia was to a large degree New Zealand. Melanesia, which is kind of the lower left-hand quadrant, was Australia, and Micronesia was the United States, in part because that's where Guam is, which is part of the United States, US territory with US citizens, same for the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, and also the 3 freely associated states, Palau, which we'll speak about a little bit with Dr. Hayakawa, Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia. These are independent countries, but they have a compact of free association with the United States, where the United States takes care of their defense and security. Understanding this construct is kind of important for the discussion we're going to have. The region tends to be discussed as the Pacific Islands, or inaccurately the South Pacific, which would not include, for example, the Micronesian countries. But each country, each of the 3 countries that we have represented here, US, Japan, and Australia, actually have a very different view and engagement with different parts of the region. Now, what happened was this was sort of staggering along as a strategic construct and having some difficulties. And those difficulties became very, very clear When China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi visited the region recently, these are the exclusive economic zones of the countries that he physically visited. This is, of course, during a time of COVID, when these countries had quarantine restrictions in place, but they essentially waived quarantine restrictions to let Wang Yi in, restricted their own media coverage, and did a whole series of things that showed how close the relationship was becoming in the case of some countries with China. And in particular, the Solomon Islands, which signed a security agreement with China that I think surprised a lot of people with the depth of the potential engagement of including Chinese military troops in the region. Now, the region's leaderships are very varied in their response to this. So while Prime Minister Sogavare of the Solomon Islands has been receptive to Chinese advances, President Panuelo of Federated States of Micronesia wrote a very strong letter explaining why he thought that this sort of engagement was a really bad idea. So the leaders of the region are looking for different options, some more closer to China, some more closer to new partners or renewed relationships with existing partners. And this is the context for our discussion today. We'll talk about the three countries that we have represented here and how they view their roles in the region, or how our representatives feel like their countries view their roles in the region, what their goals are, and what the potential for engagement is, and where the strengths and weaknesses are with the other countries, and then where Canada might fit into all of this. So with that, I would like to turn over to our first speaker, who will speak for about 4 or 5 minutes about the Australian perspective, and that would be Professor Blaxland. So over to you, Professor Blaxland.
Great. Thanks very much, Cleo, for that really helpful round-out overview. Australia obviously, sees the Pacific as its immediate neighbourhood. Some call it its backyard, but it's more appropriate, I think, to call it its front yard, or its immediate neighbourhood. It's about getting the terminology right, being more respectful and not treating the possessions or anything like that, because Australia actually has never owned the territory in the Pacific, except for having colonial oversight of Papua New Guinea and, for a while, Nauru, particularly after the First World War mandate of Germany was handed over to Australia. But the Pacific has long had a British connection, and so it's been kind of Anglophilic. It's been English-speaking, based on common law, and have, in the last few decades since independence in the middle of the 20th century, particularly the 60s and 70s, tended to send their kids to school in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, or Auckland in Australia and New Zealand, essentially. And that, look, for a long time it's been taken a bit for granted because it's been seen as a bit of a strategic backwater. We've been a little bit cavalier. About 20 years ago, we launched the Regional Assistance Mission to the Solomon Islands at the invitation of the Solomon Islands government, and that seemed to be a very positive step. But one of the key provisions of the Townsville Peace Agreement was political reform, and that really didn't kick off very well. That was pushed back on, and we're seeing the legacy of that now with the Sogavare government basically not wanting to change the dynamics there. But essentially, what we've got at play in the Pacific is, I think, a range of factors here, an overlap of great power contestation, the perception of looming environmental catastrophe and the felt need to respond to that, and then a spectrum of governance challenges that are really difficult to deal with, relating to microstates with very little oversight and easily influenced by transnational criminal elements, people smugglers, drug smugglers, and to a certain extent the prospect of terrorist groups operating as well, although not majorly at the moment. So when you think about the overlap of those things, Australia's tended to focus under the previous government on great power contestation and launched the Pacific Step Up, to engage in the Pacific with a range of programs that were intended to bolster ties with those countries in the Pacific, the Pacific Patrol Boat, a fusion centre, a range of schemes that were about bolstering security, governance, oversight, accountability, but not infrastructure. And this is where China has been very effective at getting in with, objects, sports stadiums, bridges, buildings that can be stamped made by China, leaving a much more obvious physical legacy that Australia hasn't sought to compete with, and I think maybe it probably needs to think about. We see in the Pacific, there was a coup in Fiji. There's been multiple coups in Fiji for Australia. Australia pushed back and kind of ostracized Fiji for a while until Fiji started to play us off against the great powers, inviting Russia to participate and then engaging with China as well. And that generated real kind of the scales came off the Australian policymakers' eyes, and there was a sense that we really need to have a rapprochement with Fiji. That coincided with elections in Fiji that provided the justification to lift the kind of the political sanctions and to seek a reconciliation with Fiji and reinvigorate ties with the Pacific Islands Forum, which we just saw the last iteration of in Fiji, and very warm ties. So Australia has been bolstering ties, particularly as a consequence of responding to the needs following tsunamis, cyclones, natural disasters, with our amphibious capabilities, our aid program, and we're seeing in the Pacific this idea of the Blue Pacific and the idea of the Pacific Islands Forum member states wanting to be more assertive, wanting to be more treated with greater prominence, reverence, if not dignity, and less in a less patronising way by Australia and others. Australia has always worked very closely with New Zealand in its engagement in the Pacific, and when we think about particularly militarily, we've worked very closely with New Zealand over the Solomon Islands, in engagement in Bougainville, certainly in East Timor, and other programs in the Pacific. We work collaboratively with New Zealand. There's a new government in town in Australia now. Anthony Albanese is the new Prime Minister, who's with Defence Minister Richard Marles and Foreign Minister Penny Wong, have actually been following a line that in terms of substance is not that different from the previous government, but rhetorically has made a very significant difference, allowing for a bit of a reset in terms of the resentment that was building up in certain pockets to Australia's reluctance to address climate change related issues. And that led to a really warm feeling in the Pacific in response. Penny Wong, Cleo talked about the Wang Yi visit to the Pacific, and that was quickly followed by Penny Wong's visit. Now, it's very interesting, the timing of the Wang Yi visit. Just as the Australian federal election was taking place, I suspect China was anticipating it would take a week or two for a government to settle. There was speculation that it would be quite contested and quite divided, but in fact, the election outcome became quite clear quite quickly. And it enabled Penny to act for the Anthony Albanese to double down on the arrangements that they had agreed on in opposition, namely the Quad, but also AUKUS. So the first thing Anthony Albanese did after being signed in as Prime Minister by the Governor-General was to fly to Tokyo to meet with Quad leaders. Meanwhile, Penny Wong was getting ready to fly to the Pacific as well. So quite a proactive approach by the new government, a much more politically attuned response, even though substantively many of the policies that they're following are ones that the previous government had adhered to. But there's a recognition that there's a felt need to be more respectful. We have significant hang-ups with visas and allowing Pacific Islanders to come to Australia. And there's incremental steps to doing more, but I think Australia needs to go considerably further. I've argued that there's a need to establish a grand compact with the Pacific, and certainly, that can take a variety of different forms. And I'm now starting to think perhaps it's best to articulate this in terms of something somewhere between a structure like ASEAN and the European Union, whereby the governments of the Pacific actually work collaboratively. They don't lose sovereignty, but they work more collaboratively to address the challenges. And look, the Australian government does seem to be heading in that direction broadly, but incrementally. They're taking very careful steps, eager to avoid pushing China and eager to avoid getting blowback from the Pacific, who are quite proud of their independence and their own policy. So I'll probably better leave it there, Cleo. Thanks very much.
Thank you. That gives us certainly a lot to think about and follow up on in the discussion afterwards. Dr. Hayakawa, would you like to talk a little bit about what you've done in the region and how you see Japan's role evolving?
Yes, thank you. And actually, I do not want to tell you that I'm working for Pacific now 3.5 decades. Well, thank you very much. Where shall I begin to talk about Japan's perspective? I'd like to start around the First World War. But the reason why I can talk here today is due to my mentor, Professor Akio Watanabe, so I'd like to focus on him. Let me start 1979. Prime Minister Ohira announced the Pacific Basin Community concept, which has free and open value. This concept led to APEC and then to current TPP. Professor Watanabe was a member of the study group and was in charge of Pacific Island Studies. I'd like to mention that original English title of this concept was Pacific Ocean Community. After the end of the Cold War, Professor Watanabe was appointed to Prime Minister Hosokawa study group and wrote a policy report on Japan security, commonly known as Higuchi Report in 1994. This policy advocates that Japan should develop multilateral security based on the Japan-US alliance. The US had radically responded to this report with 9 initiatives, and Japan-US strategic dialogue was accelerated. However, even after 9/11, Japan's self-defense force failed to make a significant move. In 2008, I had launched the Micronesian Maritime Security Project based on the Higuchi Report. Another reason was that Admiral Keating, commander of Indo-Pacific, pointed out at the public hearing that China suggested dividing Pacific Ocean between the US and China. In addition, I was told by my friend, high official of Palau government, that Keating said only Japan and US can defend this vast Pacific Ocean, but it is the US that has tied Japan's hand and feet. It is Article 9. So I decided that if the US took that position, I would untie those strings. The Higuchi report also mentioned that the possibility of Chinese threat, but Abe's security diamond makes the world clearly aware of China by using provocative phrase. The South China Sea seems set to become a Lake Beijing. If you remember back to 2008, almost no one recognized China as threat. On the other hand, Micronesian countries had problems on their own maritime security capabilities. Japan's presence in Micronesian water was welcomed by the US Secretary Clinton. However, the Rudd administration of Australia strongly opposed. The Australian Royal Navy was also considered that Micronesia, north of equator, is their backyard. Australia's attitude toward Japan has changed 180 degrees since the Abbott administration took office. After Abe's visit to Australia in 2014, the JMSDF destroyer Kirisame was invited to Albany of Western Australia for the Anzac ceremony as part of the centenary of Japan-Australia Maritime Cooperation. That is our First World War's experience. Then in 2017, I was invited to 2 parliament study groups. I explained how China, including criminal organization and military, have infiltrated to the Pacific Island countries. Then I was asked by MP Eto, the right-hand man of Abe, about the relevance of the Abe security diamond concept. I pointed out that the vast Pacific EEZ formed by Pacific Island countries have become almost lawless, and this point is totally overlooked from the security diamond. The following year, 2018, Indo-Pacific and maritime security became the agenda of Pacific Island Leaders Summit. Then JMSDF started to move toward Indo-Pacific. China is certainly a threat, but even before that, the security and safety of island countries were fragile. Transnational crimes such as human trafficking, drug money laundering were taking place. Not only China, but all kinds of criminal activities had infiltrated. Japan is gradually understanding the reality of Indo-Pacific and is implementing multilateral security based on the Japan-US alliance, which my mentor, Professor Watanabe, argued. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hayakawa. That's extremely helpful insight into the development of how Japan has been looking at the region and particularly the Pacific Islands. The Japanese role has visibly been increasing, and I think we're getting a sense of why. So thank you very much for that. Colonel Newsham, over to you.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Cleo. I appreciate the opportunity. I'll just give a few ideas from an American perspective and from my perspective about the Pacific region, particularly the middle of it. It sort of reminds you of those old maps from like medieval days when you would get out into the middle, beyond the coast, and they'd have sea lions and waterfalls where the world ended as far as anybody knew. And that's pretty much been how the middle of the Pacific has been regarded by the Americans for a good long while. That's a little bit of hyperbole, but not much. America has taken the middle of the Pacific, the Central Pacific, the South Pacific, the Southwest Pacific for granted, unfortunately. And that's where the term benign neglect was in fact coined. But it's not that the United States has not done anything in these regions. It in fact has underwritten the infrastructure, provided a lot of services for particularly the Central Pacific nations. And in fact, far more than the People's Republic of China has, but you'd never know it from the perceptions. But it's been a place that has gotten the limited treatment, sort of the minimum needed, that decency required to say, well, we have a presence, we're paying attention to the Pacific Islands. But it was never the primary focus of, I would say, American diplomacy, American military activities, and even the economic angle. And it really wasn't even in the top 10, I would say. The emphasis in Asia was always on the edge, the western edge of the Pacific. Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, a little bit of Southeast Asia. But the Central Pacific was really taken for granted. And as a result, what we've seen is about a 30-year political warfare effort by the People's Republic of China to insinuate itself throughout the Pacific. Some of my friends in the Pacific have told me I'm wrong, that it's actually a 50-year effort that's ongoing. But it has been done really without the Americans paying the necessary attention to it. And that is something that does typify, I think, unfortunately, the official American treatment of the region. And it's not as if the locals don't notice. And that is a huge part of the equation from our perspective. Now, I would suggest that there probably has never been a new foreign service officer who was just dying to get that post in Pohnpei, Micronesia, rather Vienna with the nice European coffee culture as where they're lined up for. Same in the American military. Once again, you make your name in Afghanistan, the Middle East, or something more directly dealing with the potential for a shoot up with China. But the guys who were interested in paying attention in the middle of the Pacific, they were weirdos, or that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but just never got the attention. Much of the American military involvement in the region is episodic or ephemeral, a bit like the Harlem Globetrotters showing up, putting on a show. Everyone likes it, and then they go home. And that's not a nice thing to say, but that unfortunately is how it's been regarded, or you will have a 3 or 4-star admiral or general make the rounds, have tea with a local leader, and go home. And everyone thinks, well, they love us. And they do. Actually, we are very popular in the region. But unfortunately, when you go away, you leave a vacuum, and that vacuum has gotten filled very effectively by the People's Republic of China. America has also amazingly outsourced a lot of its efforts in the Pacific, particularly the Southwest Pacific, the South Pacific, to Australia and New Zealand, respectively. Generally, outsourcing has its uses, but it's not ideal. And certainly a country like the United States, it's with 330 million people, literally all the money in the world, or at least printing all the money in the world, should be able to have embassies and a presence in these places. So here we are, though, but with the Americans finally, sort of like a drunkard who's woken up and, from the stupor, saying the Pacific is important, the middle of it, the Chinese are there, we've got to do something. It is late in the day, of course, but once again, the game's not over. But you are seeing renewed attention to the middle of the Pacific from the US government. And this really started during the Trump administration, and they deserve lots of credit for that. The Biden administration has also recognized it, the need to engage, to be there. And in fact, one of the top officials apparently said anonymously that America needs to step up its game. But one does ask what exactly he's been doing for the last 2 years. And in this case, he's had 30 years of involvement in it. But that's another issue. So the point is, America is finally taking an interest in an area that is absolutely of strategic importance to them. And we'll see how they do. Will they be able to tie together the diplomatic, the economic, the propaganda, in the good meaning of the word, the military aspects of all of this into an effective political warfare campaign, bringing in their friends, the Australians, the Japanese, New Zealanders, even the South Koreans, and say putting this into a systematic campaign plan. They very much need to do it. So we'll see how that goes.
Thank you very much. I'm going to just follow up on that. If you could, I think we'll just, given the geographical spread, maybe we will focus on that Central Pacific area, which is that Micronesian area. And Colonel Newsham, if you could just describe you mentioned that it's strategic importance. Could you explain its relevance, for example, in a Taiwan scenario?
Oh my goodness! This is one where you don't have to have any military experience. You just have to know how to look at a map, and you can see the importance of the Pacific Islands. The U.S. approach to sort of operations in the Pacific has been centered on something called the first island chain, which goes from Japan down to Taiwan to the Philippines and down to Malaysia, depending on how you count it. And the idea was to defend along those lines. And what you've gotten after this 30 years of Chinese subversion and influence efforts has been a Chinese presence popping up in the back of your defense line, which is the Central Pacific, South Pacific. And actually, it goes all the way to the west coast of Latin America, if you look at the inroads that have been made. So if your idea is to defend Taiwan and you're expecting easy access from the east, we may find ourselves having to fight our way through a Chinese presence, or if the presence hasn't fully developed, we have countries that don't really want us there, that are objecting to American military activities. Similarly, the Australians, who have really bravely spoken up on Taiwan's behalf, if this Solomon Islands business comes to fruition, they may find that before they get their Navy and Air Force up near Taiwan, that's smaller than it was when they started. So it's a pretty basic thing. You don't want your enemy in your rear, and that's pretty much where they potentially are.
Thank you very much. Professor Blaxland, on just 2 questions. One, it seems, as you mentioned, sort of Australian policy is changing. It seemed like for a long time, the Australia's Pacific Island policy was led mostly by DFAT, by foreign affairs and trade. And now there seems to be more involvement from defense or maybe other sectors. So the first question would be, who is leading Australia's policy on the region? And then the second, in respect to your proposal, the Grand Compact idea, where does Micronesia fit in? For example, there are 3 countries in Micronesia that already have a compact with the United States. So is it a vision for the whole region or parts of the region? Or what do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Cleo. Terrific. So can I just comment briefly on Grant's point about the RIA? And I think it's really an important one, but I think I'd want to go one step further and think about, there's that wonderful book that was published about 23 years ago now called Unrestricted Warfare. And look, it was very informative, and kind of some people kind of found it just implausible. It just seems so extreme, so over the top. And what we're seeing, though, is much of what
Professor Blaxland, would you like to tell a little bit more about the book and who wrote it?
So it was written by 2 military academics in China who wrote about political warfare and media warfare and information warfare. What's the third one, Cleo? I'm just having a blank.
So lawfare, psychological, and media.
Lawfare, yeah, right. So I think, and you, Cleo, have written about, the idea of entropic warfare, which I found quite a compelling one. But what I'm finding is the word warfare is catching people out. And so kind of it gets pushed back because they think, no, well, we're not at war. What are you talking about, John? I think what we're facing is, and I've written about this a little bit, is the idea of a continuum of from cooperation, collaboration, and a little bit of competition to contestation and conflict. And I think what we're facing is unrestricted competition. And I think it's probably for some of our listeners, it might be useful to think about the challenges we face as being about competition, some of which is quite healthy. Some of it's a little bit bruising, and some of it is downright unhealthy. But it is nonetheless, it's in that space. And so when we think about the policy changes in Australia, you're right, it's been largely DFAT-led. But to be fair, there are other agencies that have had a very prominent role that have not got much of the kudos. Defence has been pretty active in the Pacific. Also, Australian Federal Police has a significant presence in the Pacific, particularly in Solomon Islands, but across many of the other small Pacific states that have a not inconsequential police presence. And our Pacific Patrol Boat program, the Air Force's oversight, ISR surveillance flights in support of local sovereignty issues, are ones that have been a defence lead in coordination with DFAT, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Who's leading now? Look, it strikes me that this is something that is getting more buy-in from our Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. So it's more seen as a national issue now, a interdepartmental issue that requires a coordination across what we call whole of government. But it's even more than whole of government. It's requiring a coordination with, we talk whole of government, usually federal government, but we're needing coordination with state and federal governments and NGOs and other bodies that are involved in the Pacific, because there's a lot of policy to coordinate. Like, we've got a labourer program where we get Pacific Islanders to come to Australia for set periods of time, 3 or 4 months, to come and pick fruit or work in various capacities. And there are visas that go with that. They've been quite restrictive. And so the new government is looking to review that and open it up, mindful that this isn't a defence, it's not a DFAT, it's not a police issue. It's actually, it's all of them together. Where does, on the Grand Compact, look, I wrote about this in about 20 months ago now, and my thinking is evolving. And I touched on this when I talked about the idea of a compact that's maybe something between the ASEAN model and the EU model. And Rieko's idea of the Pacific Ocean community, I think, goes somewhere there as well. And it's not fixed, but look, there's a sense that in the Pacific you've got to go incremental, that you can't go big or you'll go bust. And so perhaps the idea I had was that you would go with some of the smaller microstates, the more vulnerable ones, subject to sea level fluctuations and storm surges, and that are really facing an existential threat, and offer them the Grand Compact. But I'm a little bit torn actually as to whether or not it would be better to go with something bigger, something more ambitious, but it has to be respectful. And this is the key thing. If we're going to treat these states that are really challenged at the moment with dignity, then we need to be mindful of their own circumstances. We need to be listening to their concerns, and we need to be actively engaged. The key hang-up, in my view, the key constraint on this being successful is the third part of the Venn diagram. I talk about governance challenges, and there's a vested interest in certain political figures in keeping things the way they are because of what you talk about with entropic warfare, the fact that they can be subject to exploitation, they can gain financial benefits from aligning with China and with using that to then play off against their opposition, allowing unrest to be fomented, and then China to then capitalize on that. And we're seeing that unfold in Solomon Islands. But it's not linear, and the game's not over. And Grant touched on this before. This is a journey we're on. We haven't reached a destination, and we have agency. And this is where the Australian government is, despite the views of some who are saying, oh, well, we should almost give up because there's nothing we can do to stop China. There is a view that no, we have considerable agency. The Pacific states have agency. And they, by the way, they gravitate towards us. As I say, they can send their kids to school in our cities. They speak English. They've got common law systems. There is a gravitational pull towards each other that it needs to be very cautious. We need to approach it very cautiously to avoid being seen as haughty or neo-colonial, and being respectful, but nonetheless is actually, I think, broadly in the common interest of the Pacific states and of the contiguous states, Australia and New Zealand in particular. Can I just add, I think there's really an important opportunity for greater collaboration, particularly with the United States and Japan, who are active in this space as well. And there are others as well. India's buying in, India with its diaspora in the Pacific, France, of course, with its recently confirmed presence in the Pacific with the Matignon Accord plebiscites having been completed. There's the questions about its future have been pretty well resolved, and they have a legitimate place in the Pacific, which needs to be recognized. And here I think there's an opportunity to maybe draw in from France that EU modeling, the EU experience, to speak to some of the maybe some kind of hybrid governance model that doesn't detract from independence and the authority of individual states, but that super enables them by working together as a team.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful, and we'll get back to outside French would say, of course, they're resident power, but where people like countries like Canada can come in. But the issue that you brought up of sort of the Pacific Islanders getting much more involved in leadership, or at least starting to say what they need. We're seeing it very clearly in Palau, and Dr. Hayakawa has been working to support their national security coordinator position. And I was wondering, Dr. Hayakawa, if you could explain a little bit about what that groundbreaking NSC position is. And I think Palau also published a national security strategy. So just to give us an idea of how the people of the Pacific are leading this themselves.
Okay, thank you very much. And let me explain why I'm old Japanese woman involved Palau, because basically I did not skip the history. Huge Japan has mandated territory, Micronesia, for almost 40 years. So still Japan and Micronesia have strong ties. Maybe that is the reason why I'm working for Palau now as a volunteer. And one of the reasons behind the establishment of Palau National Security Office, maybe the Chinese criminal gang have boldly entered the center of government since around 2019. At one time, about 1,000 Chinese and other Asian online gamble criminals had entered Palau. Even though Palau has free association agreement with US, the US is not free to take any action or on law enforcement at any time. So a president must make a decision. I think it is correct to say that National Security Office, which is under the direct control of president, is the point of contact for this. Palau security strategy must be well prepared when receiving assistance, not only from US, but also from other countries. And without NSS, Palau will lose its sovereignty and the right to self-determination. This NSS was written by National Security Coordinator, Miss Jennifer Anson herself, without assistance of white expatriate. It seems obvious, but it's admirable that this can be done in island nation where human resources are limited. She's more than 10 years younger than me, and she's a good friend of me, but I'm extremely proud of her. And I'm also scared of her too.
We all are.
So island people have strong will, political will, so we just need to follow them.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jen Anson, who's the National Security Coordinator of Palau and was previously prosecutor there, has done incredibly brave and strong work, as you described, in part also to try to clean up the international organized crime in Palau. And it's worth mentioning that Palau, what's the population of Palau, Dr. Hayakawa?
Less than 20,000.
Yeah, so it has less than 20,000 people, and there were more than 1,000 Chinese organized crime personnel that passed through there quite recently. So the threat is enormous, and this isn't a country that is in a compact of free association with the United States. And the U.S. is supposed to take care of its defense and security. That agreement, that compact, is up for renegotiation now. And I'm wondering, Colonel Newsham, if you'd like to talk to us a little bit about the importance of the renewal of the compact and where that's going.
Well, if America can get these deals done, it will be as important as an action as we can do as anything militarily in the region. It would show the countries that we do give two hoots about them, and that we're going to support them. It is about that simple. You know, we provide them money, support the right to live in the United States in exchange for us having a the right to first access in their militarily and to take care of their external defense. But we're arguing over these tiny amounts of money. And it's just astonishing that, as I say, the administration cannot get these done. But if it's done, the ripple effects will felt throughout the region. Other countries will see as well that America's kind of got its act together, that it is going to stick around. And you might even have some prospects for offering similar agreements to a couple smaller nations in the Central Pacific as well. But this is one of these small actions that really ought to take about 30 minutes to get done, that have an outsized effect. But as I say, it's just breathtaking that these haven't been completed yet. And you know, I'll bet you that the presidents of each of those so-called COFA states, they've got a blank check from China on their desks. But that is a further evidence that it hasn't been cashed or filled out, is that just how much they do want to be part of that US sort of world. And that would include the free nations in that as well, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan as well. So it's really quite moving, actually, the diligence or the affection these people have for us, despite us having not treated them as well as we might. But the amounts of money we're talking about, it would be about an eighth of a second of Medicare fraud in terms of the US national budget, just nothing at all.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, and it's worth mentioning that these three countries are two of the three recognize Taiwan, and the president of the third one, David Panuelo, wrote that very strong letter about Chinese interference in the region. And I think there's some critical U.S. assets, military assets there as well. Is that correct?
Oh, that's right. It's just look at the geography once again. It's right in the middle of an east-west access or west-east access through the Central Pacific. The islands were important in the World War II for a reason, and that reason hasn't changed at all. So you don't have so many an American military presence the way there ought to be, at least a permanent one. But Palau, a year and a half ago, offered the Americans to set up a military base in Palau, and that's something we should have jumped on immediately. But there is a U.S. military is showing more interest in that country as well, and seeing more of a sort of permanent presence. But Marshall Islands, we have strategic bases, particularly for missile testing, and Micronesia is willing to have the Americans have more of a presence as well. And we talk about presence, it's not like putting up a huge base. It really could be even just a small civil affairs team like they used to have. That is there, led by, say, a good young officer who has that magic. And really, that's what it takes. And possibility also of setting up, say, National Guard units, and/or making more of an issue, making more use of some of the reserve units which exist in the region as well. So, as I say, it's go back to World War II, and I guess. That's sort of becoming older history, but these islands were fought over viciously for a reason, and that has not changed. And one of the great ironies is that the Chinese are basically doing what the Japanese did in the 30s in terms of establishing their presence. And the Chinese are smart as us, and they understand the military usefulness of these bases. And it's just loosely related. It's not a COFA state, but Kiribati, where the Battle on Tarawa was fought. That's only 1,000 miles or two from Hawaii. The Chinese have just signed a deal with the government of Kiribati. Part of it calls for rebuilding a U.S. World War II era airfield. There's some other airfields as well that are going to be worked on. And suddenly the Americans have something to worry about pretty close to Pearl Harbor once again. So as I said, if you know a little history, it does look awfully familiar.
Thank you very much. We're coming to the end of our time, so I'm just going to go to Professor Blaxland. I think who will have to leave soon. Do you have any thoughts for how Canada could possibly engage or be useful in the region?
So Canada has a long history in the Pacific, and I think most Canadians tend to forget that particularly in the Second World War, there were Canadian forces deployed around the rim of the Pacific, going from the Aleutian Islands and the Battle of Kiska, right through to the Burmese campaign and the deployment of signals intelligence specialists in Darwin in Australia in 1945. Of course, we have a long pattern of established relations with Canada through a range of mechanisms. I call Canada our strategic cousins because we have so many common points of interest and shared concerns and commonalities. But Canada has, because of its kind of center of gravity being towards the East Coast, has tended to be neglectful of its Pacific orientation. But it is as close to the challenges of Northeast Asia as Australia is. You just need to spin the globe differently and get away from the Mercator projection and realize that you are just as close as we are. And that means that you have a stake in the Pacific. And you, alongside France, the United States, the United Kingdom, actually have a considerable buy-in and opportunities and obligations in the Pacific. Let's not forget, we also fought alongside in the Korean War. Things like that can draw you in at short notice despite your proclivity to go elsewhere and focus on things like NATO. Now, NATO itself, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, we forget that several of those countries actually are Pacific powers as well, Indo-Pacific powers as well. One of them is Canada. Canada actually has probably got to think about muscling up a little bit and thinking about how it's important for its interests to collaborate with its principal security partners, not just the United States, but Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and others, to bolster the common interests, the commons, if you like, the international space we share, not just the physical territories of the Pacific, but the way we operate this here and in this space. It's more contested. There's more competition than ever, and Canada has a role to play. And I would encourage Canadians to think beyond the East Coast, beyond NATO, as just being about Europe. Canada has played in the past in the Pacific. It has a role to play in the Pacific. It has interests in the Pacific. They overlap with the United States and Australia and Japan and others, and they need to be attuned to that overlap and the need to collaborate more closely.
Thank you very much. That's helpful and good refocusing of the map. I think we've got too many Atlantic-centered maps up on our wall. A few Pacific-centered maps would be very helpful. Dr. Hayakawa, do you have any thoughts about Canada or closing remarks?
Yes, thank you. I'm arranging a JMSDF visit to Palau last year and this year. And this year, US, not only Japan, US, UK, United Kingdom, and Taiwan navies came to Palau last few weeks. So I'm totally ignorant about Canada, but there's a huge potential that Canada will join this joint operation, especially now Palau is ready to receive any like-minded countries, navies, law enforcement. And I think I can help them. And also to join them, I think it is important to recognize that security is about people. And that is the reason why I arranged a lot of community activities for Japanese military JMSDF in Palau. They had cleaning up Japan Navy's grave and judo kids exchange and music concert with Indo-Pacific and other military groups. So if US, Japan, or Canada, whatever, came to Pacific Islands, their first priority is people of Ireland, not Japan, not US, not Canada. And I have some concern about the free association of US. Free association is basically protect US security. But I'd like to ask US to change their mind that security should be priority on Pacific Islands people. As it's generally naturally become the protect US and other countries. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a very helpful and apt refocusing on not the geography, but the demography of the people who are there, because really that is, and we are very aware they're not represented in this conversation, this particular panel that we're having, partially because the goal of this one is for Canadian policymakers to understand that this is an already congested, complicated zone. And coming into it, there needs to be a bit of an understanding of everybody else's different priorities. But as you say, with the priority of the people of the region being placed at the forefront, if anything, not only is it morally correct, but it's actually the only thing that's going to work anyway. So thank you very much for refocusing us on that. And to bring us home, Colonel Newsham, if you have any thoughts on Canada or any closing thoughts on this whole topic, over to you.
Sure. Yeah, I'm always thinking about Canada. It's at the top of my mind. But no, that said, there's a lot actually that a big contribution Canada can make when you actually think about it. They won't have to want to make the contribution. I don't think that's a huge problem. But you consider how small most of the South Pacific and Pacific islands are, that with a little bit of investment, and particularly human investment, physical investment, financial investment, you get this outsized return. And that's something to keep in mind, is that just a diplomat or two, if it's the right one, in one of these islands, is they can have far more effect than being the fourth assistant secretary at the EU delegation in Brussels. And that's something, as I say, to keep in mind, that the potential return is always pretty big. But to have an effect, you look at what the Chinese have done. They've established a presence, they've offered some benefits, and they've given the country some respect. It is, of course, greased by just god-awful corruption, but nonetheless, that presence, benefit, and respect really does make a difference. And so for Canada, like any country, to have an effect, you do have to have a presence. And it can't be handled, I would say, by someone operating out of New Zealand or Australia. But you have to have just a small number of diplomats there, physical presence, and then a benefit. You think of what is it that Canada can offer? It either distinct on its own, say distinctively, or as part of, say, a larger American, Japanese, Australian infrastructure project. What is it that they can actually offer? And one thing I would suggest that Canada might wish to consider is the issue of transportation. This is a huge issue in the Pacific Islands, is simply getting from island to island by boat or by aircraft. And there's always a need for it. And Canada, I think, has some good experience with this, with their First Nation villages all over the place, which face a very similar problem. And this is an area where Canadian expertise and experience could make a difference, and people see this. And if they make sure that everything you do has maple leaves all over it, and that was something that would provide a concrete benefit, and it's what the Chinese do very effectively. So that's a concrete suggestion. Additionally, it's a big place, the Pacific. So Canada really perhaps should choose some place, some part of it, where they think they can make a particular contribution, and then stick with it, and make this a long-term, decades-long operation if necessary. And that's important. These should not just be periodic sort of projects that leave everyone feeling good and then you go away. But it's that permanent presence. And where would Canada make that, establish the presence? Well, they'd do some research, but certainly where the French language is spoken, somewhere where there may be a possibility. It's a logical thing to it. And once again, if you get, make it so locals can go to Canada for education, for residence, work, etc., that is a benefit. And once treating people with respect, once again, sometimes you just have to pay a little attention to them, and it's surprising, and you don't have to give them an envelope of cash like they get when they show up in Beijing, that it makes a huge difference. So as I say, I actually think Canada could make a big contribution without, it doesn't have to cost a lot of money or people. It just takes the willingness to do it. And so I'm not sure that poutine will become popular in the islands, but that said, it's Canada's got a role to play, and as Professor Blaxland said, Canada's role in the region goes back a long time, and there's a lot of Canadians who sacrificed for that. And so personally, I've always been glad when I was the attaché in Tokyo, when there was a Canadian attaché there, and these guys had outsized influence, just like the Australian attachés do. Small country, but they have an effect. So I hope the Canadians do take advantage of what they can do in the Pacific, either on their own and with their friends as well.
Thank you very much. Those are some very interesting ideas. The First Nations ideas is, I think there's a lot of resonance there, especially with leadership within the First Nations communities who've had to deal with a lot of the challenges that you see in the Pacific Islands around land ownership and balance of power issues and things like that might make very good bridges. And of course, the French thing, the residents of or citizens of New Caledonia, Wallis and Futuna, and French Polynesia can study in Quebec for the same rates for graduate school as Quebec students. So that is also something definitely to build on. very helpful, all three very helpful recommendations that I hope we go back and think about very carefully. So with that, I'd like to thank very much Professor Blaxland, Dr. Hayakawa, Colonel Newsham for indulging us and giving us so much of their time and thought and expertise at what are very awkward times of the day for them. And we definitely have benefited from it, and hopefully we'll build on it.